Most of us were handed the same story in school, and we never questioned it. The Cold War began because of ideology: communism against capitalism, freedom against tyranny. The Soviet Union wanted to spread its system across the planet, and the United States stood up, alone and noble, to stop it. That's the version. Clean, satisfying. Good guys on one side, bad guys on the other, and a wall in Berlin to make it all easy to picture. It's been repeated so many times, in textbooks, in documentaries, in the speeches of presidents, that most people accept it without a second thought. But I want you to try something with me. For the next few minutes, forget the ideology. Forget the flags and the slogans and the mushroom clouds. And instead, follow the money. Because when you do, a completely different story appears. A story that is far stranger, far more uncomfortable, and far closer to the truth. Everyone knows the Cold War started because the Soviets were expansionist and the Americans were defending the free world. But if you follow the money, the real origin of the Cold War doesn't begin in Berlin or in Moscow, or even in the ruins of 1945. It begins in a quiet resort hotel in the mountains of New Hampshire, in a room full of economists, during a war that wasn't even over yet. And at the center of it stands a man almost nobody has heard of, a mid-level Treasury official, a man who built the financial architecture of American power for the next 80 years, and who, at the very same time, may have been passing secrets to the Soviet Union. His name was Dexter White, and the fact that you probably don't know that name tells you almost everything about how the story of the Cold War has been told to you. So here's the question I want you to sit with. The question the standard history is afraid to ask. Not who started the Cold War, but who profited from it. Let me show you what I mean. The story we're taught starts in 1945. The war ends. Two superpowers are left standing. They stare each other down, and the world freezes into 40 years of tension. Simple. But the seeds of that conflict were planted earlier.
Now pay
Much
close
earlier.
attention to the North
Not in the
Atlantic
rubble
shipping
of
lanes.
Berlin, but
This
in the
route
wreckage
here,
of the
marked in red,
1930s,
was
when
vital
the
for
entire
supplying our
global
allies
economy
during the
didn't just
crisis.
stumble, it collapsed. To understand the Cold War, you have to understand the Great Depression first, not the poverty and the breadlines, though those matter. You have to understand what the Depression did to the machinery of the world, to trade, to money itself. Before the 1930s, the world ran on something called the gold standard. Think of it as a shared rulebook for money. Every major currency was tied to gold, which meant that money had a fixed, predictable value across borders. It made international trade smooth. Everyone was playing by the same rules. Then the Depression hit, and the rulebook was torn to pieces. Nations panicked. Each one tried to save itself by hurting the others. They raised tariffs, which are simply taxes on imported goods, to punishing levels. The most infamous example was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, an American law that jacked up import duties on more than 20,000 foreign products. Other countries hit back with tariffs of their own. Then they started devaluing their currencies, deliberately making their own money cheaper so their exports would undercut everyone else's. Economists have a name for this. They call it beggar thy neighbor. You try to save yourself by making your neighbor poorer. And it worked exactly as badly as it sounds. Global trade didn't just shrink, it collapsed by roughly 65% between 1929 and 1934. Two-thirds of the world's commerce simply gone. In that wreckage, in that mass unemployment and desperation and rage, something else took root. Fascism. The economic collapse of the 1930s fed directly into the political extremism that would drag the world into the Second World War. And the men who would later build the post-war order learned one brutal lesson from all of it. A lesson they would never forget. Economic warfare leads to real warfare. When you strangle your neighbor's economy, you don't just make him poor. Eventually, you make him dangerous. So by the early 1940s, while the Second World War was still raging across 3 continents, while soldiers were dying by the millions, a small group of American economists and planners in Washington began working on something almost impossibly ambitious. They wanted to design a new economic order for the entire planet, from scratch, a system engineered so that the catastrophe of the 1930s could never happen again. No more trade wars, no more currency chaos, no more beggar-thy-neighbor spirals that ended in gas chambers and firebombed cities. It was a beautiful idea, a noble one even. But here is the thing about building a new order for the whole world. Somebody has to sit at the top of it. Somebody has to write the rules. And whoever writes the rules of money writes the rules of power. That was the real question, hiding underneath all the idealism. Not just how do we prevent another depression, but who gets to be in charge of the system that prevents it? And the man who answered that question, the man who shaped the post-war world more than almost any general or president, was that obscure Treasury official I mentioned, Harry Dexter White. Let me tell you a little about him, because he's one of the most fascinating and troubling figures of the entire 20th century, and the way history has quietly erased him is itself part of the story. White was born in 1892 in Boston, the son of Lithuanian Jewish immigrants. He came from nothing. He clawed his way up through sheer intelligence, eventually earning a doctorate in economics from Harvard. He was brilliant, driven, and by every account, quietly ruthless. He rose through the Treasury Department under Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr., and he became one of the most powerful economic policymakers in the United States, without ever becoming a household name. While the cameras pointed at presidents and generals, White worked in the background, drafting the blueprints for a new world. His great rival in this project was a man who was his exact opposite in almost every way. On the British side sat John Maynard Keynes. If you've heard the name of any economist, it's probably his. Keynes was aristocratic, charming, world-famous, and supremely, almost arrogantly confident in his own genius. Two men, one quiet and obscure, one brilliant and celebrated. And they were about to fight over the design of the entire post-war economy. Here's the part that should stop you cold. When these two men clashed, it was the quiet American nobody remembers who won. Decisively. And the system he built would shape the lives of billions of people who never once heard his name. The stage for that fight was set in July of 1944. The war was still on. D-Day had happened just weeks before. Men were still dying in the hedgerows of France. And yet, in that same month, 730 delegates from 44 Allied nations traveled to a grand old hotel called the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, nestled in the White Mountains. They were not there to plan a battle. They were there to answer a single, deceptively simple question. After this war ends, how should the world manage its money? That question sounds dry, technical, the kind of thing you'd skip past in a textbook. But underneath it was the most important power struggle of the century, because whoever controlled the answer would control the levers of global finance, and whoever controlled global finance would hold the real power in the world that came after the war. Not the visible power of armies, the invisible power of money. This was the Bretton Woods Conference, and it is arguably one of the most consequential events of the entire 20th century. And yet, ask 100 people how the Cold War started, and I promise you, not one of them will mention it. That's the myth I want to take apart. Not that the ideology was fake, Stalin was real, his brutality was real. The terror of living behind the Iron Curtain was real, and I will never pretend otherwise. But the ideology was only ever half the story. The other half, the half that got buried, was about money, about who controlled the world's currency, about who ran the banks that ran the planet, about markets and debts and a $10 billion loan that was promised, and then quietly, fatefully, never delivered. To understand how a conference full of economists in a mountain hotel set the world on the path to 40 years of nuclear terror, we have to forget the slogans. We have to stop asking who was good and who was evil. We have to look at the numbers, we have to look at the names, and we have to follow the money. Because the story that follows is not the one you were taught. It's a story about a system deliberately designed to make one nation the master of all the others, about the men who built it, and about the moment they decided that instead of bringing their greatest ally into that system, they would lock him out of it entirely and set the world on fire in the process. Let me show you exactly how the money worked, the debts, the dollar, the gold, and how a bankrupt British Empire was quietly stripped of its crown by an American official most historians would rather you never think about at all. To understand how the Cold War really began, you have to understand what was actually being fought over in that mountain hotel. And it wasn't ideology, it was the most valuable thing on earth. The right to control the world's money. Let me explain what that means, because it's the key to everything that follows. In 1944, there was one question that mattered more than any other. After the war, whose currency would the world run on? Whose money would every other nation hold in its vaults, use to pay its debts, and trust to settle its trade? Whoever won that question wouldn't just be rich. They would be the banker to the entire planet, and the banker always sets the terms. Two men arrived at Bretton Woods with two completely different answers. John Maynard Keynes, representing a bankrupt and exhausted Britain, came with a plan that was, on paper, genuinely fair. He proposed creating an entirely new international currency. He called it the Bancor. It would be managed by a neutral international institution, and here's the clever part. That institution would have the power to penalize any country that ran up too large a surplus, and any country that ran up too large a deficit. In plain language, Keynes wanted a system where no single nation could dominate, where the rich couldn't simply bleed the poor. A system of equals, refereed by a neutral body that answered to everyone and no one. It was elegant, it was multilateral, and it was completely unacceptable to the United States, because Harry Dexter White had a different vision, and White's vision put one thing at the dead center of the world economy: the American dollar. Here's how White's system worked, and I want you to really hear this, because it ran the world for the next several decades, and its shadow is still over us today. The dollar would be tied to gold at a fixed price, $35 for 1 ounce. And then, every other currency in the world, the British pound, the French franc, all of them, would be tied to the dollar. Do you see what that does? It makes the dollar as good as gold. Better even. Because gold just sits in a vault, but dollars can be printed. Every nation on Earth would now need to hold dollars in reserve. The dollar wouldn't just be American money anymore, it would be the world's money. And the two great institutions White designed to manage all of this, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, would be headquartered not in some neutral city, but in Washington, D.C. They would be controlled primarily by whichever nations put in the most capital. And the nation with the most capital, by an enormous margin, was the United States. So under Keynes's plan, America would have been one powerful voice among equals. Under White's plan, America would run the entire system. It wouldn't just participate in the new global order, it would own it. Now you might ask, how did the obscure American simply steamroll the most famous economist alive? How did White win? The answer is the most important lesson in this entire story, and it's one word: debt. Britain was broke, utterly catastrophically broke. 6 years of total war had drained the empire dry. Britain had sold off its foreign investments, borrowed enormous sums, and mortgaged its future to keep fighting Hitler. By 1944, the British Empire, which had ruled a quarter of the planet, survived only because of American loans. It was living on Washington's credit card, and White knew it. He knew that every clever argument Keynes made could be answered with a single brutal fact. You need our money to survive. So you will take our system. As one historian later put it, the Americans simply used to their advantage the reality that the United Kingdom depended completely on new loans from the United States. That was the whole game. Keynes had the better ideas. White had the money, and money won. So when the delegates left that hotel, they hadn't just created a new monetary system. They had transferred the financial crown of the world from London to Washington. The sun was setting on the British Empire, and Harry Dexter White made absolutely certain that America would inherit the throne. This is the part the textbooks skip. They'll tell you the Cold War was about tanks and ideology. They won't tell you that before a single Cold War shot was fired, the United States had already engineered a financial system that made it the master of the capitalist world. That system had a name. It didn't wear a uniform, it wore a suit. But here is where the story takes a turn that almost nobody sees coming. Because White, the man who built this monument to American financial dominance, was at the very same time trying to do something his own government would soon consider close to treason. He was trying to bring the Soviet Union inside. Think about how strange that is. The man architecting American economic supremacy was simultaneously working to make Stalin's Soviet Union a full partner in it. White's vision wasn't only about American power. It was about something bigger and, depending on how you look at it, either naive or visionary. He believed the two great powers left standing after the war, the United States and the Soviet Union, would decide the fate of the world, and he believed the only way to avoid another catastrophe was to bind them together with money, with shared institutions, with mutual interest. He didn't just believe it quietly, he acted on it. For 5 months before Bretton Woods, White personally met with a high-level Soviet delegation in Washington. He patiently walked them through the benefits of joining his new institutions. He listened to their fears about being trapped inside a capitalist system. He tried to reassure them, and then he went further than anyone else was willing to go. 6 months after the conference, White proposed something extraordinary: a massive low-interest American loan to the Soviet Union to help it rebuild from the devastation of the war. The figure he proposed was $10 billion. Hold on to that number, $10 billion. In the money of that era, an enormous sum. More than 3 times the transitional help he had recommended for Britain. That loan is one of the great forgotten hinges of the 20th century, because whether or not it was offered would help determine whether the Soviet Union joined the American-led economic order or built a rival one, whether the world would have one economic system or 2 armed camps. Keep that $10 billion loan in the back of your mind, because later I'm going to show you exactly what happened to it, and it will make you angry. But first, we need to talk about the shadow hanging over White himself, because this man, the architect of the Western financial order, was also accused of being a Soviet spy. For roughly 11 years, beginning in the mid-1930s, White was suspected of acting as a Soviet source inside the United States government, of passing documents, of providing strategic advice to Moscow. 2 former members of the American Communist Party, Elizabeth Bentley and Whittaker Chambers, named White as a Soviet agent during the Red Scare that gripped America after the war. And later, when the government declassified a set of decoded Soviet cables known as the Venona intercepts, investigators found roughly 15 references that appeared to point to White. Sit with the strangeness of that. The man who designed the financial fortress of the West may have been quietly loyal, in some fashion, to the East. Now, I have to be honest with you here, because the truth is genuinely murky, and anyone who tells you it's simple is selling something. Some historians argue that the Venona evidence, read carefully, suggests White was a target of Soviet intelligence, someone they were trying to cultivate rather than a committed agent taking orders. Many of his meetings with Soviet contacts happened when the 2 countries were wartime allies, and plenty of those meetings were completely public. The IMF's own historian has argued that the espionage case against White was always thin, and that in the McCarthy era, guilt by association was practically a national sport. But on the other side, there's little doubt that White shared information with the Soviets that went well beyond what was necessary or appropriate. He was, without question, far more sympathetic to Soviet interests than the political climate of the late 1940s could stomach. So was he a traitor, a visionary, a useful idiot, a patriot playing a longer game than anyone around him understood? The records don't give us a clean answer, and maybe that ambiguity is the point. What we do know is how it ended. In August of 1948, White was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee. He sat in front of the country and denied everything. He denied being a spy. He defended his vision of cooperation with the Soviet Union. 3 days later, he was dead. A heart attack. He was 55 years old, and his dream, the dream of pulling the Soviet Union inside the Western financial system, instead of locking it out, died right there with him. Within 3 years of Bretton Woods, the entire vision of a shared, cooperative post-war order that included the Soviets had collapsed completely. The world had split into 2 hostile economic blocs, 2 systems, 2 currencies, 2 futures. The question is, why? Why did the cooperation die? Why was the $10 billion loan never delivered? Why did the most powerful nation on Earth choose to lock its greatest ally out of the system it had just built? The standard story tells you the Cold War began with Soviet aggression. Stalin grabbed Eastern Europe, communism demanded global revolution, and America had no choice but to respond. And look, there's truth in that. I'm not going to lie to you to make a cleaner story. Stalin was paranoid, brutal, and genuinely expansionist. The Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe was real, and to the people who lived through it, it was terrifying. That happened. That's not a myth. But here's what the standard story leaves out. It leaves out the sequence. It leaves out who acted first. Because when you lay the events out in order, follow the money, and watch the timeline carefully, something uncomfortable emerges. The economic decisions came first, and in many cases they provoked the very aggression they were later used to justify. Let me show you the first trigger, the one almost nobody talks about. It's May of 1945. Germany has just surrendered. The war in Europe is finally over. The Soviet Union has paid a price for that victory that is almost impossible to comprehend. 27 million dead, entire cities erased, a generation of young men gone. And to win that war, the Soviets had leaned heavily on something called Lend-Lease. This was the American program that shipped war supplies to its allies, and the scale of it was staggering. Over the course of the war, the United States sent about $50 billion worth of supplies to its allies. In today's money, that's somewhere around $690 billion. The Soviet Union received roughly 11 billion of that. And we're not talking about abstract numbers. We're talking about 18,000 aircraft, around 435,000 trucks and jeeps, nearly 2,000 locomotives, mountains of food, fuel, and raw materials that kept the Red Army moving and the Soviet people from starving even worse than they already were. Without American Lend-Lease, the Soviet advance against Hitler would have been far slower, and the suffering far greater. Both sides knew it. It was, for a moment, the one thread of genuine cooperation holding the alliance together. Now watch what happens next. Watch closely. On May 12, 1945, just 4 days after Germany's surrender, the new American president, Harry Truman, signed an order suspending Lend-Lease shipments to the Soviet Union. And it wasn't done gently. It was done with a suddenness that stunned everyone. Ships that were already at sea, already sailing toward Soviet ports, were ordered to turn around. Vessels sitting in American harbors were literally being unloaded, their cargo pulled back off the decks. Imagine being Stalin. You've just lost 27 million people helping to destroy Hitler. The bodies are barely cold, and 4 days later, your ally yanks the supply line out from under you so abruptly that ships are physically turning around in the ocean. Stalin never forgot it. Later, speaking to Harry Hopkins, one of Roosevelt's former advisors, he called the way it had been done unfortunate and even brutal. And he issued a warning that, in hindsight, reads like a prophecy. He said that if the cutoff was meant as pressure to soften up the Russians, it was a fundamental mistake. He warned that reprisals of that kind would produce the exact opposite of what the Americans wanted. Now, Truman would later claim it was all a bureaucratic blunder. Overzealous officials, he said, had taken the order too literally. He reversed it within 3 days. But here's the thing about a message like that. You can take it back, but you can't unsend it. The damage was already done. Because the Soviet economy wasn't like the American economy. It was centrally planned. Every factory, every output target, every shipment was mapped out years in advance from the center. The Soviets had built their entire industrial plan around the expectation of continued American supplies. When the flow was cut off without warning, it wasn't just insulting. It was genuinely destabilizing. And more than that, it sent a signal. A cold, clear signal about what this new American administration thought of its wartime ally now that the shooting had stopped. The message Stalin received was simple. The friendship is over. You're on your own. And we hold the money. This is where a school of historians called the revisionists makes its most powerful argument. And whatever you think of their conclusions, their evidence is hard to wave away. The most important of them was a scholar named William Appleman Williams, whose groundbreaking 1959 work shattered a comfortable myth Americans loved to tell about themselves. The myth of innocent isolationism. The idea that America just wanted to be left alone and only got involved in the world reluctantly. Williams looked at the record and argued the opposite. He argued that the United States had been pursuing an aggressive, expansionist economic policy since at least the 1890s. He called it the open door policy, a systematic, decades-long effort to pry open foreign markets to American goods and American investment, to knock down tariffs and trade barriers wherever they stood in the way. Under this reading, the Cold War wasn't some sudden defensive reaction to Stalin. It was the next chapter in a much older story, a story about American economic expansion that had been running for half a century, and that happened to run into Soviet resistance along the way. Williams made a lot of people uncomfortable, but his core insight is difficult to dismiss when you actually look at what America built after the war. The Bretton Woods system, the coming Marshall Plan, the whole architecture of the post-war order was engineered to create a world that was open to American trade and American capital. And the fact that this same system also happened to contain and isolate the Soviet Union, that wasn't a side effect. Williams argued it was the point. Now let me give you the second great trigger, because it's the one history remembers as an act of pure generosity, and the truth is far more calculated. The Marshall Plan. In June of 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall stood up and announced a sweeping program to rebuild the shattered economies of Western Europe. Over the next 4 years, the United States transferred roughly $13 billion to 17 European nations. In today's money, that's around $137 billion.
The
And it worked.
stability of the post-war
Genuinely,
global
the Marshall
economy
Plan rebuilt
relies
devastated
entirely
economies.
on the
It fed
agreements
hungry
we reach
people.
here
It
this week.
stabilized democracies that might otherwise have collapsed into extremism. That's all real, and it deserves to be remembered. But the Marshall Plan was also something the postcards don't mention. It was a tool, a brilliant one. It was designed to bind Western Europe permanently to the American economic system and to create a vast, stable market for American goods. Because here's the fear that kept Washington up at night. Without wartime spending, would the American economy slide right back into the Depression? The Marshall Plan solved that. It created reliable customers for American manufacturers at exactly the moment they needed them. And crucially, the aid came with conditions. Nations that took Marshall Plan money had to agree to reduce their trade barriers and adopt market-oriented, open economic policies. In other words, they had to open their doors to American business. The open door, exactly as Williams described it. Now here's the detail that reveals the whole game. The Marshall Plan was, on paper, offered to everyone, including the Soviet Union and its Eastern European neighbors. And the Soviet Foreign Minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, actually showed up. He came to the initial planning meetings in Paris, he sat down at the table, and then, after just a few days, he walked out. He declared the plan was nothing more than a tool of American economic domination. And you know what? He wasn't entirely wrong. Because the conditions attached to that money, the open markets, the reduced barriers, the free flow of capital, were fundamentally incompatible with a centrally planned Soviet economy. To accept Marshall Plan aid, the Soviets would have had to crack open their entire system to American influence. It was an offer engineered in a way that Moscow could not possibly accept. And it went further. Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other Eastern European countries actually expressed interest in taking the money. They wanted in, and Moscow forced them to decline. Because Stalin could see exactly what was happening, he could see American economic power reaching directly into his sphere of influence, and he slammed the door. His answer came fast. In September of 1947, Stalin established the Cominform, a bureau to coordinate the communist parties of the world. And at its founding meeting, a Soviet ideologue named Andrei Zhdanov delivered a famous speech dividing the entire world into two camps, an imperialist American camp on one side and a democratic, Soviet-led camp on the other. The battle lines were now drawn. The two-camp world had officially begun. But I need you to notice the sequence, because this is the whole argument. The economic architecture came first. Bretton Woods, the Lend-Lease cutoff, the Marshall Plan. These came before the hardened political and military confrontation. In many ways, they provoked it. The financial decisions weren't a response to the Iron Curtain. They helped build it. And there's one more player in this drama, the most terrifying one of all. A weapon that some historians argue was aimed not just at Japan, but as a message to Moscow. We've been talking about conferences and currencies and men in suits, but I don't want you to lose sight of what all of this actually meant. Because financial decisions made in quiet rooms have a way of landing on the bodies of people who were never in the room. People who never heard the names Bretton Woods or Harry Dexter White. People who simply lived and suffered and died inside the machine these men built. So let's talk about the price. And let's start with the most terrible weapon ever created, the atomic bomb. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945 remain among the most debated events in all of human history. And the story most of us learned in school is simple. The bombs were dropped to end the war with Japan quickly and to save the hundreds of thousands of American lives that would have been lost in a full-scale invasion. And there is real evidence for that. The Japanese military really was prepared to fight to the death. The day after Hiroshima, Japan's Supreme War Council met and was still arguing over surrender terms that went far beyond anything the Allies would accept. The fanaticism was real, but in 1965, a historian named Gar Alperovitz published a landmark study that offered a darker interpretation. Drawing on the diaries of the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, and other newly available documents, Alperovitz argued that the primary purpose of the atomic bombings may not have been military at all. His argument was that Japan was already close to surrender, that American leaders knew it, and that the bombs served another purpose entirely. A demonstration, a message, not to Tokyo, but to Moscow. A way of announcing to Stalin that the United States possessed a weapon of unimaginable power and would not hesitate to use it. Now, historians still argue fiercely about this, and I won't pretend it's settled. But consider what it means if there's even partial truth to it. It means that two cities full of ordinary human beings, schoolchildren, mothers, shopkeepers, the elderly, may have been vaporized in part to send a diplomatic signal in a struggle over the post-war order. Somewhere between 70,000 and 140,000 people died at Hiroshima, tens of thousands more at Nagasaki, many instantly, many slowly, over months and years from burns and radiation. If even a fraction of the motive was to intimidate the Soviet Union, then those people were not just casualties of a war against Japan. They were the first casualties of the Cold War, killed before the Cold War even had a name. That's the price, and it was only the beginning. Because now let's return to that $10 billion loan, the one Harry Dexter White proposed to help the Soviet Union rebuild. I told you to hold on to it. Here's why it matters so much. The Soviet Union came out of the war shattered. Not just 27 million dead, though that number alone should stop your heart. Entire regions had been burned to the ground, 1,700 towns and tens of thousands of villages destroyed. Factories gone, farms ruined, a country trying to rebuild itself out of ash. White's $10 billion loan could have helped. It could have given the Soviets a real stake in the new economic order. It could have kept the door of cooperation open a little longer. Records indicate that the decision not to offer that loan turned out to be one of the primary reasons the Soviet government decided against joining the IMF and the World Bank in the first place. Think about that. A single financial decision, a loan proposed, then quietly allowed to die. And with it died the last real chance of one shared world instead of two armed camps. Without that loan, without any meaningful stake in the American-led system, the Soviets had every incentive to build their own.
I met many people
And that's
during the
exactly
war,
what they
Senator.
did.
I cannot
Two
recall
economic
that
blocks
specific name.
hardened into place, and the ordinary people caught on the wrong side of that line paid for it for the next 40 years. Because here's what the two-camp world meant for the human beings living inside it. The Iron Curtain wasn't only a military boundary, it was an economic one. When the two blocks solidified, hundreds of millions of people in Eastern Europe were locked into a closed, centrally planned system, cut off from the trade and investment flowing through the Western economy. Shortages became a way of life. Waiting in line for bread, for shoes, for the basics became normal. An entire half of a continent was economically walled off, and the people inside it had no say in the matter at all. And on the other side, in the West, the price took a different shape. It came in the form of the permanent war economy. Once the Cold War calcified, the United States and its allies committed to a state of permanent military mobilization. And permanent mobilization is expensive. Over the roughly 4.5 decades of the Cold War, the confrontation consumed trillions of dollars. Trillions. Now ask yourself where all that money came from and where it went. It came from ordinary taxpayers. Working people in every country involved handed over a share of their labor, year after year, decade after decade, to fund an arms race. And a great deal of it flowed into what became known as the military-industrial complex. A vast network of defense contractors and their political allies who, over time, developed a powerful vested interest in keeping the conflict going, because the conflict was, for them, extraordinarily profitable. Follow the money, and you find that the permanent state of tension wasn't just a burden to be endured. For some very specific people, it was a business model. Fear had become a product, and it sold very, very well. But the heaviest price of all wasn't paid in the capitals of the great powers. It was paid on the periphery, in the proxy wars, because the two superpowers were too afraid of nuclear annihilation to fight each other directly. So instead, they fought each other through other people's countries. Korea, Vietnam, Angola, Afghanistan, Guatemala, Nicaragua, a long bloody list of nations that became battlegrounds in a struggle that was, at its root, about which economic system would dominate the planet. Millions of people died in these proxy wars. Millions. Farmers and villagers and children in places most people in Washington or Moscow could not have found on a map. They didn't die for their own quarrels. They died inside someone else's contest over markets and influence and control of the global economic order. Their homes became the chessboard. Their bodies became the pieces. And when you strip away the ideology, when you follow the money down to where it actually lands, this is what you find. A struggle framed as freedom versus tyranny, but paid for in the currency of ordinary human lives. I want to be careful and fair here, because this story has real villains on every side. The Soviet system was genuinely brutal to its own people. The gulags were real. The police state was real. The crushing of the Hungarian uprising in 1956 and the Prague Spring in 1968 were real. Stalin's regime murdered its own citizens on a horrifying scale. None of the economic argument I'm making erases any of that. The suffering behind the Iron Curtain was not invented by American propaganda. It was real, and Soviet leaders inflicted it. But that's exactly the trap the standard story sets for us. It offers us a simple deal. Because one side was clearly monstrous, we're invited to believe the other side was purely noble. And that's the part that doesn't survive contact with the evidence. Because the evidence shows a struggle that was, underneath the slogans, about who would control the money, who would run the institutions, whose currency would rule the world. And in that struggle, the people who suffered most, the vaporized citizens of two Japanese cities, the walled-off populations of Eastern Europe, the taxpayers funding an endless arms race, the villagers dying in proxy wars across 3 continents, almost none of them ever got a vote. Decisions made by a handful of men in a handful of rooms shaped the lives and deaths of hundreds of millions of people who never knew those decisions were being made. That's the price. And it raises a question that should genuinely unsettle you. If this is what really happened, if the Cold War was as much about economics and money and control as it was about freedom and ideology, then why don't we learn it this way? Why does the simple story survive? Who benefits from keeping the ledger closed? So here's the question that should be bothering you by now. If the economic story is this well documented, if the loan and the Lend-Lease cutoff and the Marshall Plan conditions are all sitting right there in the archives, then why isn't this the version we learn? Why does the simple story, freedom versus tyranny, good versus evil, survive in every classroom, every documentary, every political speech? The answer is more interesting than a conspiracy, and in some ways more troubling. Because nobody had to hide the truth, they just had to tell a more comfortable version of it, loudly enough and long enough that the comfortable version became the only one most people ever heard. Let me walk you through how that happened, because the history of how this history got told is a story in itself. In the first couple of decades after the war, one version dominated completely. Historians now call it the Orthodox school, and its argument was simple. The Cold War was entirely the fault of the Soviet Union. Stalin was aggressive, communism was expansionist, and the United States was simply responding, reluctantly and heroically, to a threat it did not create. This wasn't a fringe view, it was the official story. It was taught in schools, printed in textbooks, and repeated by the government. And you have to understand why it was so appealing. It was true enough to be believable. Stalin was aggressive. The Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe did happen. So the Orthodox story wasn't a lie, exactly. It was a half-truth that left out everything inconvenient. and a half-truth that flatters you is the most durable kind of story there is. Then, in 1959, that comfortable consensus got its first real crack. That was William Appleman Williams, the historian I mentioned earlier. He looked at the same events and asked a question nobody in the orthodox camp wanted to ask. What if American economic expansion was a cause of the conflict, not just a response to it? Williams and the historians who followed him became known as the revisionists, and they turned the orthodox story on its head. They argued that the United States had been pursuing the open door, the systematic opening of foreign markets to American goods and capital, for half a century. They pointed to the abrupt Lend-Lease cutoff, to the conditions on the Marshall Plan, to the $10 billion loan that died in a drawer. They said, look at what America built, and look at who it benefited, and stop pretending it was all just self-defense. One revisionist, Thomas Patterson, pushed the argument to its sharpest edge. He contended that the United States would have pursued the same globalist, market-opening policies whether or not the Soviet Union had ever existed as an adversary. In other words, the enemy was almost beside the point. America was going to build its economic empire regardless. Stalin just happened to be standing in the way. Now, I have to be honest with you, because I promised I wouldn't sell you a clean story, and the revisionists had a real weakness. They sometimes went too far. In their eagerness to expose American economic motives, they had a tendency to treat Stalin's regime as merely reactive, as if the Soviets were just responding to American pressure and had no aggressive designs of their own. And that was a genuine error. It underestimated Soviet brutality and Soviet ambition, both of which were very real. So the field did what serious fields do. It corrected. Out of the clash between the orthodox story and the revisionists came a third position, the one that dominates serious scholarship today. Historians call it the post-revisionist synthesis, and it's mainly associated with the historian John Lewis Gaddis. The synthesis says something that sounds obvious once you hear it, but took decades of argument to reach. Both things were true at once. Soviet expansionism was real, and American overreaction also significantly worsened the confrontation. It wasn't one side's fault. It was a tragedy of two great powers, each acting on its own interests and fears, spiraling into a conflict that neither fully controlled. And here's the detail that matters most for our story. Even the historian widely regarded as writing the most sophisticated account of early American Cold War policy, Melvin Leffler, in his landmark 1992 study, came down on the side of security rather than pure economic imperialism as the main driver. But, and this is the crucial part, his own meticulous archival work showed just how deeply intertwined economic and security concerns were in the minds of American policymakers. They didn't separate the two. In their own heads, protecting American security and protecting American economic dominance were the same project. So notice what's happened here. Among serious historians, this is not actually a secret. The economic dimension of the Cold War has been argued about, refined, and largely accepted for over 60 years. The archives are open, the debate is public. Which brings us to the real answer to our question. If the scholars know all this, why doesn't the public? The answer is that there's an enormous gap between what historians argue in academic books and what filters down into textbooks, classrooms, and popular memory. And that gap doesn't stay empty. It gets filled by the simplest, most flattering story available. Think about who tells the popular version of history and why. Governments tell it, and governments have every reason to prefer the version where their nation is the hero and its motives are pure. A story of noble America defending freedom is far more useful to a state than a story of America engineering a financial empire and locking out a rival for economic advantage. One version builds patriotism, the other invites hard questions. Textbooks tell it, and textbooks are built for simplicity and consensus, not for uncomfortable nuance. It's far easier to teach a 14-year-old that the Cold War was freedom against communism than to explain Bretton Woods, currency convertibility, and the open-door policy. The complicated truth doesn't fit on a worksheet, and the culture tells it through films and monuments and anniversaries, all of which reach for the clean emotional story because the clean story sells and the complicated one doesn't. Nobody makes a blockbuster about the fine print of a monetary conference. So the truth doesn't get buried by a cover-up, it gets buried by convenience, by the slow, constant preference of institutions for the version of the past that serves them best. The half-truth wins not because it's enforced, but because everyone with a megaphone finds it more useful than the whole truth. And this is what the historians, in a sense, have gotten wrong. Not that any single school has been simply lying. The scholarship, at its best, is genuinely sophisticated. What's gone wrong is the framing that reaches the public. For too long, the story handed down to ordinary people has been telling only half of itself. The ideological half, the comfortable half, the half where the money never enters the picture. Because when you put the money back in, the picture changes. The Cold War stops being only a clash of values and becomes something more complicated. A struggle over who would control the institutions of global finance, over who would own the world's reserve currency, over who would set the rules of trade and who would profit from those rules. The ideological dimension was real. The fear was real. The Soviet brutality was real. But underneath all of it ran a second story, a quieter one, told in dollars and gold and loans and trade conditions. And that second story was deliberately left out of the version most of us were handed, not because someone locked it away, but because almost nobody with power had any reason to tell it. That's why it matters that you're hearing it now. Because once you see the money underneath the slogans, you can't unsee it. And you start to notice something unsettling. You start to notice that the same logic, the same follow-the-money logic, is running underneath the headlines in your own newsfeed today. We've traveled a long way, from a mountain hotel in New Hampshire through a $10 billion loan that died in a drawer, past 2 vaporized cities and 40 years of proxy wars. And now I want to bring it all the way home, to right now, to the world outside your window, because here is the thought that should genuinely disturb you. If the Cold War was, underneath the ideology, fundamentally about economic control, about who writes the rules of the global financial system and who profits from them, then a simple question follows. Did it ever actually end? We're taught that it ended in 1991. The Soviet Union collapsed, the Berlin Wall came down, the good guys won, history was over. But that story only makes sense if the Cold War was really about communism versus capitalism. If it was really about the money, about the dollar, about who controls the institutions that govern global finance, then the collapse of the Soviet Union didn't end the game. It just cleared the board for the next round. Look at the world today with the eyes this story has given you. Look at it as someone who follows the money now. Look at the trade wars. Tariffs going up between the world's largest economies, exactly the kind of economic weapon that tore the 1930s apart. The same beggar-thy-neighbor instinct dressed in modern language. Look at the sanctions regimes. The most powerful nations now routinely use access to the global financial system as a weapon, cutting rivals off from the dollar-based network that Harry Dexter White built in that hotel 80 years ago. That network was designed to make the dollar the center of the world. And today, that centrality is itself the weapon. White built the gun. We're watching it get fired. Look at the fight over reserve currencies. Right now, there is a real and growing struggle over whether the dollar will remain the currency the world runs on, or whether rival powers can build a parallel system to escape it. If that sounds familiar, it should. It is the exact same struggle that played out at Bretton Woods when the Soviets looked at the dollar-centered system and decided to build their own bloc rather than submit to it. The players have changed. The logic has not. And look at the competition over technology and resources, over semiconductors, over rare earth minerals, over the physical materials that the next economy will be built on. The Cold War, at its root, was about oil in the Middle East, and tin in Southeast Asia, and uranium in Africa. Today it's about lithium and microchips and data. Different resources, identical contest. Do you see it now? The costume changed, the logic didn't. The fundamental question underneath the Cold War was never really freedom versus tyranny. That was the story told in public. The costume that economic interests wore so they could march down the street in daylight. The real question, from 1944 onward, was always the same. Who controls the money? Who controls the institutions? Whose currency rules the world, and who has to play by rules they didn't write? And that question has never been answered permanently because it can't be. It just gets fought over again and again in each new generation under whatever slogans that generation finds most convincing. So the lesson of the Cold War isn't a lesson about communism. Communism is mostly gone. The lesson is about how power actually moves through the world. It moves through money, through debt, through control of the institutions that decide who can trade and who can't, who can borrow and who can't, whose money is trusted and whose is worthless. And the most important lesson of all is about you, about what you're allowed to see. For decades, an entire generation was handed a version of history with the money carefully left out. Not because someone locked the truth in a vault, but because the simple story was more comfortable, more flattering, and more useful to the people telling it. And it worked. Most people lived their whole lives never questioning it. The only defense against that, the only real defense, is to learn to see the machinery underneath the story. To hear a politician talk about freedom and values and ask quietly, and who profits? To watch a conflict unfold on the news and ask, follow the money, where does it actually lead? That habit of mind is the single most valuable thing I can give you. Because once you have it, you can never quite be fooled the same way again. The people at Bretton Woods understood something we're rarely told. That whoever controls the rules of money controls almost everything else, quietly, invisibly, without ever needing to fire a shot. Harry Dexter White understood it. That's why he fought so hard, and why, for all his murky loyalties, his forgotten dream of a shared system instead of two hostile blocks may have been wiser than anything his celebrated successors did. When that dream died, when the loan was never offered, when Lend-Lease was cut off with brutal abruptness, when the Marshall Plan was built in a way Moscow could never accept, the world split in two and stayed split for half a century at a cost of trillions of dollars and millions of lives, all of it flowing from decisions made by a handful of men in a handful of rooms. Decisions about money. That's the true origin of the Cold War, not a clash of civilizations, not a simple battle between good and evil, but a struggle for economic supremacy, wearing the costume of an ideological crusade. And now it's your turn to decide what you think. So let me ask you directly. Harry Dexter White, the architect of it all, the man who built American financial dominance while dreaming of Soviet partnership, and who may or may not have been passing secrets to Moscow the whole time, was he a man who knew exactly what he was doing, playing a game deeper than anyone around him understood? Or was he just a product of the system, swept along by forces bigger than himself? Comment below. Type yes if you think White knew exactly what he was doing. Type no if you think he was just a product of his time. I read the replies, and I'm genuinely curious which way you land. And if this changed how you see things, do something with it. Send this to one person who still believes the Cold War was only about freedom versus communism. Just one person. It might change how they read everything that's happening in the world right now, the trade wars, the sanctions, the fight over the dollar. Sometimes one video, sent to one person, cracks a story open that's been closed for decades. Then subscribe and stay with me. Because next time, I'm going to show you something specific. An internal planning document tied to the Marshall Plan from the late 1940s that lays out in plain language who the system was really meant to serve and who it was designed to lock out. It's been sitting in the open the whole time. Most people have simply never been shown it. Once you've seen the money underneath the Cold War, you start to see it everywhere. And in the next one, I'm going to hand you the receipt. I'll see you there.